If you know me, you know that I love necromancers. We've done videos on skeletons and zombies, but what about ghouls? The more I sat down and thought about it, the more I realized that if I'm building an undead operation that's supposed to make players nervous, I'm skipping the zombies and I'm going straight for the ghouls. Forget about the reskin zombie that paralyzes people. We're going to be talking about the actual concept behind the word. Once I started digging into where ghoul comes from, I actually found that ghouls are actually worth building an entire villain around. So let's get into it. A ghoul was never a corpse that got hungry, and this has been the case since before graveyards have existed. If you push it back far enough, you're into Mesopotamian mythology, faceless underworld enforcers called the Galu, whose entire job description is dragging people down to the land of the dead. Somewhere in that swap from Akkadian into Arabic, that became the ghoul, and the actual root of the word gala doesn't mean the thing that eats the dead, it actually meant to seize, which honestly kind of sums up this creature in one word, and it's also a pretty good pitch compared to shambling corpse. Somewhere along the way that got flattened, and I can point it to almost the exact guy who did it. Early 1700s, a French scholar named Antoine Galland is translating 1001 Nights for a European audience, and he takes some liberties. In his version of one story, a bride sneaks off every night to eat corpses with a graveyard monster, and that's basically the moment the ghoul got nailed down as a specific cemetery-dwelling corpse eater, instead of a shape-shifting desert predator. That version exploded. Poe was writing about ghouls a century later, and then George Romero borrowed the word again in 1968 for a completely different monster. Romero's creatures in Night of the Living Dead were called ghouls in the actual script. The word zombie isn't in there once. Critics started calling them zombies anyways, the name stuck, and then the real ghoul got left behind in the rulebooks. Still wearing the graveyard scavenger costume Galland handed it 300 years ago. So if I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna throw that shit out and go back to the predator. And that basically changes everything else about how I'd use them. So let's figure it out. The first problem is, how do I get one? The clean answer is I cast a spell on a corpse and get a minion, but ghouls in most systems aren't just zombies with a different coat of paint, are they? They're their own thing, which means the honest answer is grimier than a spell slot. Here's what I'd actually do. I wouldn't make my first ghoul, I'd let someone else make it and inherit the problem. Where a ghoul's bite carries something like ghoul fever. You get bitten, you don't get treated, and if the body isn't blessed or burned before midnight, it claws its way out of the grave as a brand new ghoul. And as a necromancer, that's not really a threat, it's actually a supply chain. I don't need a spell for that, I just need some patience, a town having a bad month, and a mortician I've quietly gotten in my pocket who's willing to be a little slow doing the last rites. My first ghoul isn't something I have to animate then, is it? It's something that I just let happen. And then I make sure I'm the one standing there to offer it a job when it claws out of the dirt, confused and starving. And something that I would probably build my whole strategy around is that ghouls in a lot of old stories aren't just fast and vicious, they're actually deceptive. The classic version of this creature could throw on a disguise, an old woman or a lost traveler or even your cousin who's been missing for 3 years, and use it to lure someone off the safe road. And in basically every one of those stories, the disguise has exactly one flaw. It's the feet. The glamour never quite covers the feet, hoofs where their toes should be. If I'm going to be running an actual ghoul operation, half of them never set foot in a dungeon, they're topside. They're the guy at the tavern who's a little too curious about which road the caravan's taking tomorrow. They're wearing a face, and the only reason my table ever catches on is if someone gets suspicious enough to actually check. I'd bake that in as a real functional tell too. If a player finally thinks to look under the table at the boots, or maybe at the way someone's standing slightly wrong, let them catch it. Give them the win. It rewards actually paying attention over just rolling perception at every NPC in the tavern, which, let's be honest, most tables do anyways out of habit. There's an old Syrian folktale built entirely around this one flaw. A ghoul poses as a poor woodcutter's long-lost wealthy sister, invites the whole family in for dinner, and the only person who survives the night is the wife, because she's the one person who actually looked at the woman's feet before she trusted her. Everybody else just sees a rich relative and stops asking questions, which translated at your table means the tell only works on the players who are actually paying attention. And if that setup sounds familiar, it should. It's basically the same trick Tokyo Ghoul does with its masks, minus the melodrama. Different genre, but the same idea is underneath it. The monster's real weapon is that you don't know that it's a monster yet. There's a whole thread of early 20th century pulp horror, H.P. Lovecraft especially, that treats ghouls less like a monster and more like a society. In Pickman's model, his ghouls aren't loners scrabbling around one graveyard. They're an organized subterranean population with their own tunnels, their own language and culture, running underneath crypts and sewers and cities all over the world. They even trade changelings with humans, swap in a monstrous baby for a human one and let it grow up thinking it's a person. That's a civilization I've decided to either recruit from or start a war with, depending on the week. And if I wanted something even stranger, there's an older pulp story by Clark Ashton Smith where ghouls aren't hiding from society at all. They're the state religion. A whole city hands its dead over willingly to a colossal living shadow called Mordidigan. Nobody's actually grave robbing anybody. That's just how this city handles funerals. I definitely think it's worth keeping both versions in your back pocket because they're two completely different pitches from the same monster. Lovecraft's version is a hidden underclass I've got leverage over, and Smith's version is an institution I have to actually negotiate with because it's got more legal standing in this city than I do. Either way, the second I stopped treating my ghouls as minions and started thinking about them as a population with their own agenda that I've temporarily got some leverage on, the whole thing gets a lot more interesting to run. Alright, so let's say you've got your little network running. The hard part isn't about combat, it's actually the logistics. A zombie doesn't want anything, it just does what you tell it, forever. They don't make complaints. But a ghoul is hungry constantly, and me saying the magic words that stop it from biting me specifically does nothing to make that hunger go away, which is why you should give every ghoul a hunger score from 0 to 3. At 0, the ghoul is sated, it's a perfect soldier, stands guard for hours, follows orders exactly and doesn't blink. At 1, it's restless, it starts getting twitchy anywhere near blood or a body, disadvantage on anything that requires it to just ignore a corpse sitting right there. 2, it's ravenous, and now I've got to make an actual check the moment blood hits the floor nearby, or it breaks off and goes for the nearest wounded creature, doesn't matter if that's an enemy or one of mine. And then at 3, it's frenzied, and unless I'm personally spending my time babysitting it, it's eating somebody. It genuinely doesn't care who. The only way to get these bad boys back down is by feeding. A full uninterrupted minute on a corpse drops it a point. So now every fight my ghouls are part of has this quiet ticking pressure underneath that has nothing to do with the enemy's hit points. Do I let my ghouls stop and feed on the guy they just dropped and lose a turn doing it, or do I push them forwards hungry and just hope I don't lose control of my own monster in the middle of a fight that I'm supposed to be winning? And if you want to picture the worst case ending, look at Fallout. Their ghouls start out basically still being people, jobs, memories, grudges, entire personalities intact. It's centuries of radiation grinding away at them that eventually tips them into what the game calls feral, mindless animal. Gone for good, you know? That's my actual nightmare scenario, not a ghoul that was always a monster, but a ghoul that I've had for 3 years that's guarded my door and never given me a bit of trouble finally cracking. Combat wise, the one thing I'd never do is line my ghouls up in the open and charge. A ghoul's entire advantage is that it refuses to fight fair. Picture the actual room. My ghouls aren't standing in the open with the party, they're up on the ceiling of the crypt or tucked behind a sarcophagi just waiting. The fight doesn't start the way the party expects. One of them drops down behind the wizard, landing a paralyzing hit, and then spends its bonus action just dragging the paralyzed wizard away out of the torchlight down a side tunnel. Now it's not just a fight, it's become a chase. Someone's getting dragged, and people are trying to stop that person from being taken out of sight and eaten. I'd probably only ever throw like 2 or 3 ghouls doing this at once, tops, because if you throw 20 at the table, they're going to spend half the fight just waiting for their turn to come back around, which is kind of horrible. If you have 2 ghouls doing the grab and drag routine, maybe one bigger ghast in the middle handling poison, and a couple of regular zombies just holding the front line so the party physically can't walk past them, should be a pretty good fight. One thing that I genuinely consider stealing, purely because of what it does to how players behave at the table, there's another piece of Ghoul folklore that says if you drop one with a single hit, it's dead for good, but hit it a second time, even just to be safe, brings it right back up to full health. I go back and forth whether I'd actually run this, because it's a bit more theatre than mechanic, and it only works with one specific type of table, but every time I think about cutting it, I remember what it actually does to how people play, and I think I'll keep it. I would never put it on every ghoul though. It's a rule that I would use for one specific named ghoul, a local legend the players hear about secondhand before they ever meet it. They say Old Maren only ever falls to one blow. Hit her twice and she gets back up laughing. Half the fun there isn't even the mechanic, it's watching the paranoid fighter refuse to take the obvious killing blow because he doesn't trust a rumor he heard in a tavern, or watching someone panic swing a second hit purely out of muscle memory and immediately regret it. There's also an Edgar Allan Poe poem about ghouls that I think's pretty good because it skips the eating part entirely and goes for something worse. A grieving man is wandering around at night and the ghoul in it never touches him. Instead, they conjure up a false, hopeful light in the sky, something like a shooting star, and just let him follow it, thinking it means something good is waiting. It leads him straight to his dead lover's tomb. They never actually lay a hand on him, they only need him to hope for a second so the landing would hurt more. I quite like the idea of a ghoul that isn't actually attacking anyone, it's just showing a player exactly what they want to see right up until it isn't there. And if I really wanted to go somewhere upsetting with this, and I would without hesitation, I'd give one ghoul something extra. There's a book by Brian McNaughton's, The Throne of Bones, that takes ghoul eating somewhere genuinely nasty. They don't just eat corpses in the book, they actually absorb it. Memories, mannerisms, whatever the person used to know and how to do. So like, say a ghoul gets your bard's body before anyone can stop it, for the next few days, that thing doesn't just vaguely resemble a person anymore, it knows your bard's spells, it knows the name of your bard's little sister back home, it might even try to talk to the rest of the party like your bard would, badly, wrong in some small way nobody can quite place at first. I love the idea of like a specific ghoul that can use a few of the deceased abilities for a while. And you know the old rule where elves are immune to ghoul paralysis? Every edition's got some poetic in-world reason for it. An elf god took pity on the first elf who got turned into a ghoul and blessed the whole species. Very touching and all that. There's actually a theory that's been going around that's a lot less poetic. Back in Gygax's original wargame, before D&D was even D&D yet, elf miniatures were expensive elite units and ghoul units were cheap swarms. Turns out, a cheap pile of ghouls could paralyze, lock and wipe out somebody's expensive elf army for basically nothing, which broke the whole point economy of the game. So Gygax just wrote elves are immune as a patch. 50 plus years later, we're still running with it. And the reason I bring that up is because it's a good reminder that a lot of what makes necromancy feel weightless in modern games isn't some grand design philosophy, it's balance patches stacked on top of each other, balance patches going back decades. A lot of newer rule sets have gone even further with it too. You don't need a corpse anymore or a black onyx, or to worry about your ghouls turning on you the second your control spell runs out at 2 AM. You just cast something, clean, temporary skeletons show up and they fight, and then they politely turn to dust when the fight's over. Pathfinder 2e does this, so does Draw Steel. The revised D&D rules are heading in the same direction, which is great for game balance, but I think it's genuinely bad for how necromancy actually feels to play. If there's no cost or hunger, no real risk that your own monster eats somebody that you didn't intend it to, you're not playing a necromancer, it's just a guy with a different coloured fireball who happens to like skulls. And if I was going to build this as an actual player character instead of a villain, I'm running behind the screen, I'd also be tempted by the uglier version, which is crafting a piece of one onto myself directly. Some settings let you take a preserved ghoul or ghast claw and, through a long, expensive, deeply unwise ritual, replace your own arm with it. In exchange, you get a real claw attack that can flat out paralyze someone once a rest. But you also lose some of your own max HP for it, and good luck getting anyone remotely pious or normal to trust you again with dead flesh hanging off your shoulder in plain sight. But let's face it, if you're crafting an arm from a dead man onto yourself, you're doing it because you've already decided the power's worth whatever part of yourself you're handing over for it. And if you want a whole side plot out of any of this, here's a free one. A city bans ghouls outright as a public health hazard, but also quietly allows something called a body contract, where a poor family can sign over a dead relative's remains for labor to pay off debt. Normally that just means a shambling skeleton doing farm work, but a necromancer, instead of raising grandma as a mindless skeleton like the contracts technically allows, decides to bring her back as something smarter, hungrier, still very much herself in a way that nobody actually signed up for. Is she still a citizen with rights? Is she property now? Whose problem is she legally when she starts asking where her grandchildren are? You don't have to answer any of that yourself. Just slap that down in front of your party and let them argue about it for 20 minutes. So basically, what I'm trying to say is, ghouls are predators and ambushers, so build them like it. Get your first one through disease and bad luck instead of a spell if you want the grim version. Run at least a couple of disguised infiltrators and give the feat away as a real catchable tail. Decide whether your ghouls are hidden underclass, you're recruiting, or an actual institution you have to negotiate with. Either one will change the whole tone of your campaign. You should track hunger 0 to 3, make feeding a real decision with a real cost. In combat, try drop, paralyze, drag and isolate one target instead of holding a line. Cap it at 2 or 3 ghouls per fight so the table doesn't stall out. And save the weird stuff, the one-hit rumor, the memory eating, for one named ghoul each. Special things stop being special the moment you hand them out to everybody. And remember that most of the rules that make necromancy feel meh were written to solve a balance problem, not a story problem. You're allowed to write your own patch. I think the real underlining point behind all of this is to make undead cost something again. That's kind of the pitch really. A necromancer who just points and a whole horde shows up, no upkeep, no risk, nothing on the line, isn't scary or that interesting. A necromancer who has to feed his monsters, build a network of things wearing other people's faces, and knows exactly which rumor about him is true and lets everybody else keep guessing. I think that's a pretty good villain. If you've got weird ghoul rules for your own table or a necromancer villain who actually got under your player's skin, drop it in the comments. If you're a player and your GM come up with a really interesting way to use these, leave it below. It will inspire others to do the same. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay spicy, adventurers.